proven and negate the resolve to alleviate income inequality in the U.S., increased spending on public infrastructure should be prioritized over increased spending on needs-tested welfare programs. Contention 1, plain politics. Dr. Wellings observes that even though increasing infrastructure spending is appealing, there is a major problem. Politicians have poor incentives to invest efficiently. Instead, they allocate resources to boost their chances of re-election. Specifically, Robert Cole explains that politicians weigh the increase in support associated with infrastructure against the lost votes associated with higher taxes, which forces them to overinvest in costly projects, meaning that political structures override the economic merits of infrastructure spending, compounding income inequality in two ways. First, special interests. James Miller explains that politicians use infrastructure to seduce interest groups because private money is interested in being used for loans to infrastructure projects. Jeffrey Stevens from Harvard observes that the primary owners of public goods are concentrated groups that stand to benefit from them, which makes infrastructure projects cash machines that hijack policies for private benefit. Brian Knight shows this materializing where districts on the Transportation Committee receive 3 times the spending, which is problematic because special interests give disproportionate gains to the wealthy. Chatterjee impacts that infrastructure spending raises the return to private capital, increasing inequality as the rich gain disproportionately, which means in the long run, income inequality increases by more than 4%. Second, eminent domain abuse. David Lewis indicates that prioritizing spending on America's infrastructure will require governments to acquire properties through eminent domain. In fact, Dr. Carpenter's systematic analysis of U.S. Census data finds that 58% of eminent domain targets are minorities below poverty, which he impacts that in 19 years, eminent domain displaced 177,000 families, most of them poor. This is problematic when Don Phillips explains displacement means a loss of irreplaceable assets, resulting in severe disruption to financial well-being and stability and job and income loss. Sharon Eckstein furthers that eminent domain furthers class warfare and economic segregation, which is problematic when Jarkowski indicates that this segregation means the displaced poor are less likely to learn about job opportunities and to have the skills necessary to be a candidate for them, increasing inequality. Contention 2, a real safety net. Subpoint A, like heat. David Holt observes that unlike food and housing, consumers cannot shop around for the lowest cost energy. So, a solution to remedying income inequality is tackling rising energy costs. Because as Monica Martinez quantifies, for a low-income household, the cost of basic household energy represents 37% of a family's income. Fortunately, this can be avoided by prioritizing spending on low-income housing energy efficiency programs. And Jackson elaborates that LIHEAP serves as a social safety net, helping low-income households to meet their home energy needs. More importantly, affirming ensures energy insecurity, as Alan Pike indicates that because Congress never puts enough money into the program, LIHEAP has never served even 1 out of 3 households who are eligible. In fact, Bradford Mills from Virginia Tech contextualizes elimination of LIHEAP will decrease the number of low-income energy-secure households by over 17%, which is problematic since the NRCA impacts that a 10% increase in electricity prices results in 1.2 million jobs lost, which Senator Scott furthers would push 840,000 more Americans into poverty. Subpoint B, individual development accounts. Young explains that in recent years, the federal government implemented programs to encourage savings among low-income families, known as individual development accounts. Roy Bouchard from Brookings furthers that IDAs debuted in the welfare overhaul of 1996. However, affirming means the program has limited effectiveness since Leslie Parrish indicates that the current act allowed for the creation of only 300,000 accounts. Fortunately, the key to expanding these programs is negating, as Bouchard outlines $600 million would extend IDAs to 500,000 people, and the current cap can be removed with a total of $12.5 billion. This is incredibly important because Kate Irish explains IDAs address the institutional barriers to savings faced by low-income households by including mandatory financial education, which is key to solving long-term income inequality, as Olivia Mitchell empirically impacts. Financial knowledge enables individuals to better allocate resources over their lifetimes. As a result, financial knowledge accumulation accounts for 40% of inequality. For all these reasons, we strongly urge that power.
That's all the department says that infrastructure projects like force the government to acquire property. First customers.
Yes. Are you going to left look at it?
Can I look at it during this?
I kind of do.
Can you flash it? Do you have a contact? Yeah. I got it.
Whoever has it. Oh, it's my screen. That says speech Octos. It's got 4 folders and whatnot.
contention one is deterioration. U.S. infrastructure is in need of repair. The National Economic Council states that 65% of America's roads are in poor condition, disproportionately in low-income areas. Schaefer of NPR adds that 2.1 trillion gallons of water are lost every year because of aging storage infrastructure. Because deficient infrastructure affects everyday life, Overhelm from the Business Roundtable adds that underperforming infrastructure costs U.S. households an annual loss of $3,100 in personal income. Reynolds, the American Water Works Association, cautions that delaying spending on restoration efforts can lead to degraded public services and higher cost potential in the case of emergency repair. Tyson from the New York Times corroborates, finding that a project which requires $5 million to fix now may cost over $30 million in 2 years. The U.S. will have to catch up with those investments eventually, and the time is now. Reynolds concludes that if we wait any longer, deferred infrastructure costs can triple the cost for a normal family by driving up utility bills and local income taxes. This would hit those in poverty the hardest, as the WEF explains that higher bills cut into disposable income among impoverished households, adversely affecting their abilities to pay for needed food, heat, and medical care. Conversely, Treyhoff to the Center for American Progress finds that making the investments needed to fix infrastructure would create 2.4 million well-paying jobs per year in retail and operations, disproportionately benefiting the poor and middle class. Covert of Think Progress adds that 90% of jobs created by infrastructure spending would be long-lasting and high-paying, while Gibson of Georgia State University writes that a 3% increase in infrastructure spending would boost the wealth level of America's poorest citizens by 147%, decreasing income inequality by 11%. Contention 2 is community revitalization. Infrastructure integrates rich and poor communities, allowing for inclusive economic development that disproportionately benefits the poor. Chapel of UC Berkeley explains that large-scale public investments are the driving force behind gentrification, a process by which richer people move to poorer communities. This week's infrastructure projects such as public transportation, improved education, and better roads provide more attractive amenities to reel in new residents. Hartley of the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank writes that the best measure for this effect is a rise in property values, and Paul from Northeastern University confirms that in 90% of cases, increased infrastructure investment increases home values at a faster rate than surrounding communities. Despite a marginal increase in costs, Byrne of Georgetown University concludes that gentrification is good on balance for the poor. This is true for 3 reasons. The first is attention politics. Leonard of the Brookings Institution explains that the influx of richer residents brings with it political influence and more consideration from the government. Freeman of Columbia University furthers that gentrifying neighborhoods see greater tax revenues and are thus more likely to finance affordable housing developments and improve education services for the poor, far offsetting any increase in rent costs. He quantifies that low-income families living in gentrified neighborhoods experience residential stability rates 24% higher than non-gentrified counterparts. But the second is development. Trout of Rutgers University finds that 70% of all long-term poverty in the United States is caused by negative environments of crime, low education, and a lack of opportunity in high-poverty neighborhoods. As high-income residents move in, they reshape the economic environment by A, bringing educational opportunities, and B, triggering regional economic multipliers by spending more on local businesses. Thus, first at the University of Chicago enumerates that poor communities that are closer in vicinity to the rich neighborhoods experience a 23% reduction in poverty and a 25% increase in college degree attainment. But the third is jobs. Bunsen of Slate magazine explains that gentrified neighborhoods contain better job opportunities compared to others because the rich bring entrepreneurship and business prospects with them. Meltzer of the St. Louis Reserve Bank consequently indicates that the number of available jobs increases by 19% post-gentrification. Vinny from the Business Insider explains that in a thriving labor market, the working class has more control because workers can complete one job knowing that others are available. They can easily demand higher wages. When job growth is weak, the tables turn. Employers have the upper hand because anyone asking for higher pay is replaceable. This effect is contextualized by Hearst, who finds that in gentrified neighborhoods, wages for the poor are 11% higher. Overall, because the poor have far more to gain from this community growth than the rich, Sharkey of the Brookings Institution concludes that a lack of integration between poor and rich communities has been the single greatest cause of income inequality over the last 3 decades. And for these reasons, I strongly urge vote for the pro.
Wait, before we run out, do you mind if we get that Sharkey card and the Meltzer card?
Yeah, I'll start on the spot.
Yeah, awesome.
And sharp. It's actually ridiculous. Oh my god. There we go. It wasn't rejected because I had the document open. So yeah. For Meltzer, you want to control up 19%, and for Sharkey, it's highlighted.
You might, do you want to show comments before you move that?
Alright.
You might ask the first question.
No, I won't.
On your second contention where you talk about like integration, right?
Yeah.
So if poor people leave the community, do you lose your impact?
Will people leave the community?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're going to bring
Okay.
evidence about
Sure.
how like 1.6% of the poor leave. Not a very big number. So where do you impact income inequality specifically with like a percentage in your case?
Well, like the welfare advocacy or the infrastructure advocacy, because Chatterjee tells you there's a 4% increase in
Right, so where was the Chatterjee study
It
conducted?
was actually a theoretical model. It wasn't.
Right, so that's even worse than actually being conducted.
Then let's talk about your Gibson evidence, right? Where was that conducted?
Okay, well Gibson, like he controls for the difference in economic
No, he does it in Mexico.
Okay, so even then, like we could
Okay.
read new evidence from Chong that says that there's a decrease in 6.5% with an economic model in the US.
Okay.
We can argue about stats later, I guess. We can take questions.
Okay, so you read us this Meltzer analysis and the Sharkey analysis.
No.
First, what does Meltzer say on page 19?
Sure you can tell me.
Meltzer says that there's not an actual increase in the net number of jobs, and it's actually a 0% increase.
In gentrified neighborhoods?
In gentrified versus not gentrified neighborhoods,
Right.
that's the kicker, because he actually does the comparative analysis on page
Okay.
18 and 19 and says there's no net benefit. when
I don't know what part of the card you're using, but like the conclusion says that when a neighborhood is gentrified versus not
Right.
gentrified,
In
like the number
large
of
zip
jobs
code
increases
areas,
19%.
large zip code areas.
Sure, yeah.
Here's the
I would
problem.
argue that the poor neighborhoods are very large zip
Here's
codes.
the problem with that.
Yeah.
That large zip code areas, 2 sentences later says that only exists if there's low displacement rates. The natural displacement rate right now is at 61%,
Okay,
which
well,
is
I don't know where you're getting that from, but our displacement rates are at 1.4%. So I guess if we
No,
win displacement
the
rates, we can still win the evidence. We can,
I mean, not necessarily, because
Okay,
he
but
still concludes there's not.
I haven't seen your evidence yet. You haven't
It's your
read it
evidence.
either. It's displacement rates?
Yeah, no, the evidence
Yeah,
that
that's what
Meltzer
I'm saying.
page
I'm
19.
saying I don't know what your displacement rates evidence
Okay,
is, so I
sure.
can't debate that.
Also, what about Sharp?
Wait, can I take a question? Okay, so why should we prioritize infrastructure if like the IDA thing that you talked about only needs like $12 million to fulfill? Sorry, why should we prioritize welfare?
Because you can't have that $12 million.
$12 million is
$12 billion, first of all.
Okay.
But you can't have that $12 billion unless you prioritize it. Otherwise, you would
That's
have already
still
done it.
nowhere near as much money as the crumbling.
Okay, that's not how
infrastructure
prioritization works. It's not about which one needs more money, it's about which one's going to be more effective. That's the problem, right?
Whoa,
If
wait, so
IDAs
if
are
there's-
more effective at decreasing
If
income
there's
inequality,
like in a vacuum, let's assume that both things are perfectly effective,
But they're
then we
not.
would still win because
that's
like
no,
we need
that's
maximum money
but
to get
we
hard.
don't exist in a vacuum. You can't advocate for
No,
money that
I'm not
doesn't
saying
exist.
that like okay, no, I meant like assuming that both Max and like Drew's rebuttals don't make any sense, we would win because like
I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen on our side at least. You might ask the question. You read the Sharp evidence at the very bottom of your second contention.
yeah.
Does he talk about racial inequality or income
Right, so we're
inequality?
gonna argue that racial equality is the biggest
Do you have a card?
contributor.
Do you have a card sit?
Yeah.
Do you, can you quantify that? Because we'll
No,
we'll say
it
that
just
wealth
says that it's the
inequality.
biggest contributor.
That's the wrong drug.
Oh yeah, there's two ones from 2015. Two short ones.
We'll just run through.
Also, do you guys have like a card that just describes how the heat works?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Do you have that flash drive still?
With the Meltzer and the Sharkey. And whenever you can get that.
Do you need it before?
No, just like I said, whenever.
Thanks.
Yes, one away from me.
Thank you.
Are any of the judges interested in a roadmap? Or
Okay.
it's going to be 2 overviews on the top and then straight down below. Okay. Yeah.
It's in the same file.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're ready.
The first overview on the round is going to come off of contention one that Charlotte reads in case that's politics. There are a couple of things that this is going to do for us. First, it means that whatever advocacy they're going to go with in round is not theirs to choose, instead it goes to special interest groups. Remember that Charlotte tells you that's really important, because that means that the politicians are simply garnering to who the money for their election cycles come from, and to where the politicians can garner the most votes, which is inevitably the wealthiest. That means that whatever they advocate for is inherently wrong, because the infrastructure is doomed to go to the wealthiest and not benefit the poor, perpetuating the cycle that's gone on for 50 years to worsen income inequality. But then, the second overview is going to be coming from Gray, who says that spending with infrastructure has historically outpaced new capital on repairs. He says specifically that 78% of infrastructure spending goes to new projects, while the remaining goes to maintenance. We have to assume, since they can't quantify to you how much is going to be split or if this is going to change, that this is the cycle that will move forward. That's important, because their first contention tells you that they're going to be repairing, while their second contention tells you they're going to be building new. That inherently can't happen, because the 78% trade-off means they will be building way more new. In 50 years, we will have the exact same problem we're facing today, with too much new crumbling infrastructure and not enough money to repair it. Go to contention one, which is deterioration. First, James Shirk of the Heritage Foundation finds that the amount of structurally unsound bridges in the United States has been cut in half over the past decade. There's no need to increase spending. You can drop them on the inherency argument right there, that there's not even a reason to increase infrastructure spending. But the second argument, even if you're buying it, is that the private sector is crowded out. Tatum finds that growth in the United States is negative when the debt to GDP ratio is over 60%. Unfortunately for them, Veronica DeRuby finds that currently in the United States, the debt to GDP ratio is 70%, which is why she quantifies that the positive multiplier effect is flipped on its head, resulting in a $1 spending on infrastructure causing negative $3.88 pulled out of the private market. That money comes directly from the poor because they're most averse because they don't have enough assets to prevent against the income shock. They're worsening income inequality long term. Then they tell you they're going to solve through jobs. First, this advocacy is terrible because Riedel says that for every dollar of spending spent on infrastructure projects, that dollar spent on jobs is pulled out of the private sector at a 1-to-1 ratio, which is incredibly bad because we access these impacts in two ways without doing that, so you can comfortably negate. Because first, welfare to work programs. Greenberg's 49 study meta-analysis indicates that welfare to work programs earn 10% more per quarter and increase employment by 3 percentage points annually. That's bigger than their impacts, reality on magnitude and time frame. But then second is job training programs. Barnett explains that current job training programs are means-tested systems, which is key because Looney finds that these types of programs boost earnings by 30%. Then, remember that Charvel tells you in Crossfire their Gibson evidence is about Mexico. Gibson doesn't adjust. He uses a country where infrastructure is terrible to use minimal builds on infrastructure to create vast and sweeping effects on income that wouldn't happen in the United States. Instead, prefer Chatterjee because his theoretical model is based on roughly like an average economy, which is at least closer to the United States. Then he finds that it worsens income inequality by 4%. Then, contention 2 is gentrification good. First, they tell you the poor will stay as the rich mix in. If they lose this link, they lose the entire argument. Here's why gentrification is terrible. First, Carpenter tells us that eminent domain targets by race, targeting minorities. So when in Crossfire or Shortville, he tells you that race is the most important factor to income inequality, they're making that worse because they're using a legal form of Jim Crow here to just force minorities out of their homes and build new fancy ones that white people can move into. But then go to their tension politics link. First, it destroys affordable housing. Matthew Parlow from Yale finds that cities tear down affordable housing to replace it with wealthier neighborhoods, meaning the poor get forced out. In fact, on development, second, they tell you that rent prices don't matter because they're offset by these benefits on education. That doesn't matter if within the month that the rent escalates, they're forced to move before the school is even built because their rent price went up by 250%. But then on entrepreneurship, Eisenberg says that the top 1% and 2% in America are always who benefit from entrepreneurship because they're the only ones with the capital to invest in it. Meaning, at the end of the day, you should buy Flanagan, who indicates that 2.5 million people are displaced from gentrification, most of them poor.
I don't think you attached the right thing to this. I asked about the heat, not like.
Oh, sorry.
No, I probably wasn't that enough. Yeah, I just want like a description of what it is. No.
Yeah, no, I already started time. Sorry about that.
What do you
Yeah,
what do you have? 55 remaining.
This is going to be that case. On contention 1, subpoint A, they say politicians are wasteful and hijack projects for private benefit. Turn this, those who succumb to private interests are in the minority. The Center for American Progress 2015 says leaders at all levels of government are dedicated to addressing disparities and ensuring that more Americans benefit from the opportunities infrastructure investment in cities create. Moreover, more corruption decreases in localization. McNichol 2016 said that local governments receive 75% or the majority of grants on infrastructure and manage the majority of costs on maintaining and improving the infrastructure that already exists. This is key because VEEP 2015 writes that local governments in which the people select their neighbors to govern the community are by far the least corrupt. As levels of government get further and further away from the people who elected them, political involvement becomes ever more unaccountable and ever more problematic. This is incredibly important because the majority of their funding is going towards local governments that are not nearly as corrupt and don't feed into the impact that they talk about. But even then, turn this again because the laws have changed. New York Times 2015 says the Supreme Court issued an important ruling that barred organizations from spending federal infrastructure and housing money in a manner that perpetuates racial segregation. Under these new rules, federal housing will be spent on transparent ways, which means that public watchdog organizations and their policy advocates will have a voice in decisions. Local governments will not be expected to solve the segregation problem, but indeed, other people can make sure that they are not making it worse. Then on Chattanooga, under the next paragraph where they cite includes that infrastructure is financed through a capital tax on income, then it increases long-run growth and inequality. At best, it's defense on the argument, at worst, it's a turn. Then on eminent domain, the Lewis link evidence is terrible. It talks about building, quote, airports, water projects, water lines, windmills, bridges, universities, and, quote, like even Maryland horse tracks. Like, it's just not our advocacy. We say that we should repair broken down roads and bridges. It doesn't necessarily require seizing new private property, just repairing what already exists. Even then, the Fifth Amendment demands that residents be paid fair dues for the use of their property, and findings from the University of Nevada indicate that a 17% overappraisal rate for houses exists, meaning that people get more money from the government if they are displaced. That reduces inequality. But moreover, eminent domain actually helps support and brings homes out from under the water. USA Today finds that city officials have discovered that they can use eminent domain power to buy underwater mortgages at their current market value and resell them to homeowners at reduced prices and mortgage payments, helping those in need. And as a result, the Department for Economics at Richmond University finds that of 12 million households, 28% of them had their mortgages fully paid off, and a other large portion didn't experience any loss in growth, in economic output and income. Now contention 2 on the safety net. First, they don't prove to you why we need to prioritize. They just give you 2 plans that look good and could be good if we expanded to. What you need to recognize is the government policy makes in seriatim. What that means is that the U.S. government deals with one issue at a time rather than multiple concerns all at once. The Municipal Research and Service Center explains that policymakers can only focus so much time, attention, and resources onto one policy and are often forced to choose between 2. Brian Jones of UNC adds that our government tends to drop issues out of consideration, meaning that there are trade-offs and one issue crowds out the other. This is the only analysis on why priority in the round is what comes first. And this is the key because they don't tell you why we need to invest now in these programs, the heap and ideas, whereas we tell you in case Tyson and Reynolds both find that if we wait longer, the cost of infrastructure will increase 6-fold because of cost acceleration, and that hurts the poor by increasing their burden by 3 times. You can solve infrastructure now, do welfare later under our analysis that is still sufficient to affirm. But then, turn this because their entire advocacy about IDAs and the heap are programs that you have to go out and apply to improve eligibility for. However, Jessica Signa of Brown University explains that poor population cannot benefit readily from service provisions or programs that are not geographically available or easily accessible. Indeed, Scott Allard of UChicago verifies improved access to the safety net and the programs that they talk about will hinge on building infrastructure systems that better link individuals in need with community resources and provisions. Stuber of the Center for Social Science writes that states are required by federal law to offer these locations. However, nearly half of all these centers are not viable locations for the poor, and these states' lack of financial support is the most important factor behind this deficiency. As a result, when you fund infrastructure, more people can get access to the programs that they talk about, which again functions as a prerequisite towards the impact. But finally is probability. These are two really, really minuscule programs that are not implemented on the federal level in a profound way. We would say that if you do increase funding on welfare, it would go to the programs that have received the most money in the past, like they talk about. In the most realistic outcome, we're not going to be funding these programs because they simply haven't been proposed in Congress. I've never heard of like either of them, and even if you have, like there's no cards that they read saying that like politicians are calling for them. There's no inherency, no probability, no impact.
Oh yeah. All the judges good? Do you mind if I take the first question? What happens if you rent a house?
I don't know. You rent?
Right, but like you tell me that like we 17% overappraise for a home. What happens if you rent?
I don't know.
I do. Do you want me to tell you?
Yeah.
So like if you're renting a home that a landowner uses, and they say, hey, we'll pay you 17% over market value for your house, two things are gonna happen. Either they're gonna say, okay, great, that means that I can increase rent by over 17% on the renters that are currently in my house because my property value's escalated, or I can just sell my house. And then there's no one, like, no house for the poor people to live in, right?
Two things.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first thing is you should read evidence specific to how many apartment owners or renters are pushed out. And second thing, like we
Well,
don't advocate for seizing private property, right? Like repairing bridges isn't going to cause.
No, you do.
like,
You advocate for seizing private property.
Right.
You advocate for increasing infrastructure investment, which inevitably causes eminent domain. Remember, you call for the car, but you don't respond to it in rebuttal. That tells you that the inevitability
And I do
of
respond to it.
what's the okay. So why does it not cause eminent domain?
Like your card talks about like building like Maryland horse raceways. Like it doesn't talk about our.
I'm looking. Steve Cook.
Yeah,
Okay.
I went and I looked up the full PDF, and it talks about like literally nothing that we say in case.
It said bridges, which you do say.
No, like first of all, it doesn't say bridges. Second of all,
You said it said bridges in your rebuttal.
We're
Are you backtracking on that now?
okay.
Look,
No,
David.
Okay,
Look,
so true. What's important
Yeah,
is that
sure.
we're not advocating for building new bridges. We're advocating for repairing them.
oh, that's another problem entirely. Okay, so we can get into that now. When you
Actually,
start
can I have
telling
a
me,
question first?
sure, go ahead.
Okay, so let's talk about your two programs, right?
Yep.
Like, has there been any proposal in Congress for like us to like?
Actually, yeah, just recently we've seen that 40 senators have joined to fund LIHEAP. The problem is they can't get enough money for it. Right there, that tells me the political atmosphere is perfect. In fact, I can't even guarantee you that in a month, that political atmosphere will be strong enough to support it. I can't guarantee
Okay,
that
I'd
right
like to see
now,
that.
it's perfect. Sure, we'll get into that.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so when you told me that,
Also, do you have stuff for IDAs that says that, or just like?
we can pull IDAs in a second, like talk about. The cards that we read in case on IDAs say that IDAs have been historically underfunded, and that's being
Right.
recognized
But,
in
like,
Congress.
you need to prove
and
that,
that's
like,
being
right now,
recognized.
it's historically been
Right,
underfunded.
and that's being recognized in Congress, and
Yeah,
they're being
that's what I'd like to see. You can have a
yeah,
question.
sure. Okay, so you told me that Congress can only focus on one issue at a time because apparently they have like the focus of a jackrabbit, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So which one are they focusing on? Building new infrastructure or repairing old infrastructure? Because I'm confused.
I would say right now they're focusing on welfare. They're talking about
No. When we affirm, are they going to focus on new infrastructure or old infrastructure?
I would
Because they can only
argue that
focus
the
on one.
National Economic Council evidence that we read is the most important and urgent.
Max, please just answer the question. They're going to focus on old infrastructure.
Structural roads, like roads are 65% like structurally.
I get that. No, I know that. But like, I'm just asking. Hey, I'm just asking. You said Congress can only focus on one thing. Is it going to be old or is it going to be new infrastructure?
I mean, like, do you expect me to say new? I'm gonna answer.
I expect you to pick one because otherwise you're going to
Old.
drop that response off the flow.
No, I mean, like, our entire advocacy on both arguments is based off of repairing, right?
So you're going with repair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. I
You
don't
can ask a
know
question. I only
that-
have like 6 seconds.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
We're on practice a second.
Thank you. How much time do I have left? Nah, thanks. Okay, is everyone ready? Does anybody need a roadmap? I'm just going to do, it's going to be the second overview that my partner gave and then three votes. First two on case, the third one on case. Okay, is everyone ready? Remember that they tell you in the last crossfire that their advocacy is going to be repaired. That's going to be incredibly important because remember the linkage to their second contention is that you have to build new infrastructure to prioritize to actually attract those rich people. Insofar as that's true, and they're telling you that their advocacy is going to be repaired, that means they just lost their entire second contention, they dealing with it themselves. But then the second observation that we're going to extend is going to be the gray analysis that tells you that we don't actually see that there's going to be any repair, and all it's going to be on actually having it's actually going to be on you, meaning we're not actually going to see their advocacy happening under them, meaning when you affirm, you don't see any of their offenses going on. Go to the first photo, which is going to be special interest. Remember that they give you these two first answers about corruption and how that's going to be solved. But remember, actually, that holistically, we still see that there's going to be 3 times more spending on the overrepresented districts. Insofar as that's true, even if there is localization, insofar as that's going to be the most comprehensive evidence, you can flow right through and you can drop those responses. But then the second response that they give you is the court-mandated argument. But remember, Edgemere tells you that even looking after court-mandated responses, we don't see the equalization of funding. You drop that response because we consume that evidence. But then, when you look at this link, overall, this is going to be the biggest impact into income inequality, specifically because insofar as the top 1% is still going to be getting the most income, that means income inequality gets worse on the top-down perspective. Insofar as that's true, they never solve for that, meaning they're never going to be able to solve for the terminal offense. That's going to be the biggest reason why they're always going to be increasing income inequality. But then, the second one is going to be heat. Remember that they tell you that we need to improve political climate. That's happening right now in concert, that 40 senators in 2016 are working together to push heat. But then they tell you that there's no focus in Congress. Fine, they'll focus on heat. That's going to be our advocacy. But then, on top of that, remember they tell you that we don't have access. That's going to happen. We're solving back at the status quo because there's online applications. The access already exists. Insofar as we went that link, this is going to be the biggest magnitude impact on the ground. Because remember, Senator Scott told you that that's going to push 840,000 more people into poverty. That means we're winning our magnitude right there. But then, the final vote is going to be turns on their case, specifically on the second contention. Remember, the Gates 16 study meta-analysis tells you that 2.5 million people are displaced from gentrification. That means they lose all the offense in their second contention. Then second, remember that they destroy housing. Insofar as that's true, there's never going to be any chance of them solving the problems that they talk about in their second contention because the poor people will just be pushed back. For all these reasons, it's strong to compound.
Can I see that after court mandate, there's still going to be
Yeah. Do you guys want to flashback?
Yeah, actually, do you want to? Yeah. Pause it over? Yeah, anytime. You just add it at the same time. 1 second, then start. How much do you need?
55 seconds.
Cool. It's just the mandate. Start. It's this Eldermidger evidence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with like an overview from like a concession, and then we'll go down our case in their case. But concessions from their case, like on the second convention, just it helps.
Let me take this here. I'm just gonna unsafely remove it. I had to erase everything on there.
In the summary speech, they concede that governments can only do one thing at a time. That means to vote for them, they need to show why you should do welfare or any other programs before prioritizing an infrastructure. We are the only team that gives you the Tyson and Reynolds evidence that says that if we don't prioritize infrastructure right now, the costs of doing that are going to multiply by 5 times every 2 years. We're the only team that actually gives you a reason for why we have to do it right now, and governments can only do one thing at a time. That is the only link into prioritization of the route. Now go to our case. The first thing is we use is the Shirk evidence that says that there's not as many crumbling bridges, but Ellison says that infrastructure infrastructure disinvestment is happening right now, and we have to stop that and start investing more so we can fix all the carbon bridges that exist. They only say that 50% of them have been solved. Then he talks about like a multiplier effect. Look, multiplier effect impacts don't matter in this round at all because they don't relate to income inequality. The third thing he says is that money for jobs comes out of the private sector, and they don't tell you why money lost from the private sector is bad. To me, that sounds like a good thing because that's a reduction in income inequality. Then they talk about job training. They don't create jobs, so increased training doesn't matter if those vacancies are available for these trained people to take. Then he said that Gibson's bad evidence, but Chong says that there's a 6.5% decrease in income inequality with infrastructure. That evidence is holistic, looks at the United States. Now, the second dimension they talk about like eminent domain targeted by race. One, we advocate for repair, not new projects. Our chapel evidence says that if we want to increase roads and schools, their link of the evidence into eminent domain doesn't talk about repair, it talks about building new things. We're not advocating for that. But then on development, they said they're forced to move within the month, but they can't move that quickly. Like rents increase gradually. They're not going to start moving within the month, and by the time rents actually increase, they'll start seeing the benefits as well. Then they say the 2.5 million people have been displaced, but the Florida evidence says that still that's only 1.4% of the total amount of people that have seen benefits. Finally, Sharkey said that immigration is the number one cause of income inequality, another clean link to income inequality for our case. But now, there are a couple things to extend. First, they dropped that they have geographical barriers to accessing welfare programs in the first place, so infrastructure is a prerequisite to welfare. But next on their first contention, the NYT evidence says that like local government people are trying not to be corrupt and are starting not to be corrupt, and new rules have been passed to make it impossible for them to be corrupt because vigilante groups have to like help out. And finally, Lewis is not part of our advocacy, and like and for all these reasons, I can suggest for an affirmative ballot.
Do you mind if we call for the Chong evidence before?
I mean, I can take it. Hold on.
Okay. You can take that transparency.
Alright. You guys ready?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you say that we don't solve for why we don't, like, you say we don't solve for geographical access, right?
We can kick that too, because you did solve for it.
Okay, so what are you gonna, like, to make this whole process a little shorter, what are you gonna not pick? Like, what's
That's,
your
I'm
advocacy
not
now?
going to tell you everything, okay?
Well, it sounds like you only have about one thing, which is repair.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's like our whole position is that we should
Okay,
repair
so
infrastructure.
just
Really, so when you said, just to be clear to everyone in the room, when you said in contention 2 that you were gonna build new schools to
That
make
doesn't-
education
if you-
better.
Okay, I'll hand you our case, and if you can point out where it says build new schools, we'll concede that. Like, our evidence from like
So
chapter
you're
says-
telling me, wait,
It
sorry,
says large-scale
so
public investment.
not a
on
single
infrastructure.
card in your gentrification contention says anything about new infrastructure.
No.
We'll call for the case then after Crossfire, I guess.
Okay,
Is that
sure.
the first time
Can
it's
I ask
coming
a
up?
question about
Yeah.
the evidence you handed us before my summary?
Go.
Sure.
So when was that study conducted?
Yeah, it was like 1972 to 2011.
1934.
To 2011.
Right, but the new policy changes.
No, no,
The Supreme
here's-
Court ruled
you're
for
misunderstanding.
2015.
You're misunderstanding the evidence. We tell you that those kinds of laws have been being passed for 90 years.
Yeah,
They've
but never
failed
under a
miserably.
Supreme Court mandate.
Right,
This
they
is
have
the
failed
first time
miserably.
they've done this.
Okay,
Never in the history of the United States has a forced mandate on infrastructure succeeded in equalizing the
Okay,
United
wait. Okay, Drew. Can you give me another example of like a time the Supreme Court literally ruled that we have to increase transparency for like watchdog organizations?
That's what one of the studies
It
was.
says, quote, we find that state governments invested more in highways than overrepresented counties between 1934 and 1960s, and these investments persisted even after court-mandated equalization.
That's
Yeah,
literally what the
verbatim.
study is about.
First of
So,
all, court-mandated equalization is not the Supreme Court mandated equalization.
Okay, so
They
what's
don't
the
do the
difference?
same case twice, right?
Yeah, and second, like our evidence comes from 2015. There's no way your evidence could possibly take that into
I don't
account.
care if your evidence comes from
Especially
2016, it doesn't change the fact that every time the court has told the states to do something, they haven't, it's been like a dead end though. You can ask me a question if you'd like.
Court.
Okay,
You
yeah.
have to ask a question now.
Go ahead.
Okay, so like, I'm having a really hard time understanding. How much is income inequality gonna go down by a million?
6.5%. That's a Chong evidence.
No, we're
He's
not
just
going
kidding,
for that.
Sean.
We're not going for that. I mean, we're not going to quantify it. We're just going to outweigh it.
So you're kicking your
Okay,
only
wait,
one page,
because
not
we
the
tell you that
Yes.
LAHEAP
Okay.
solves 840,000 people in Crossroads. Isn't that the biggest
Yeah,
market?
let's
Just
talk
like-
about LaHeap, right? So you said that there are like 40 congressional members saying we should do it now, and your evidence says,
senatorial.
yeah, sure, and your evidence says that they won't have interest in that like a week from now.
No, like that's not what the evidence says. That was me, like in Crossfire, telling you that the reason you need to like negate, or yeah, the reason you need to
Okay.
negate today
And
is because I
you
can't
did on
guarantee
Why
the
11th
political
process?
atmosphere maintains.
What?
January 11th, 2016.
Okay, so how much longer do we have to wait before they stop being interested?
I
Well,
don't.
let me
That's
start
the problem,
prioritizing.
right? We don't know, which means we should prioritize as quickly as possible, which would preferably be like today. That would be the
Okay,
best
it's
time.
been
we
like it's been
possibly
like
could.
4 months, right? So how much longer? Just a ballpark.
I literally can't. Like I am not a senator. I don't know what
Okay,
type of
sure.
person
So
I
would it
can't
be
tell you.
reasonable to say that they'll just
No, it's not going to be
continue
reasonable to
like
just predict
forever?
how long a senator is interested. Honestly, those are all of those arguments will happen to me.
Okay, sure. Then I don't know the way that. Fine.
Yeah. Can we like just look at the case? I guess is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll start rapidly. Yes, sir. We'll start. Sorry. Sorry.
Let's just shoot.
Okay. Is everybody ready? It's going to be the same vote as the charcoal hat. That makes things easier. I'm going to start on the top with the observation, the charcoal hat summary, and then extend that through, and then the voters are going to say the charcoals. So expect interest, like everybody ready? Start with the gray analysis because this becomes really muddled in the debate. Remember, we tell you they can't go for vote, which inevitably becomes that they're kicking out of this new infrastructure argument, which doesn't really work because in the case we look at, it says that there is a public transport project that they're advocating for, which at least at that point is going to be new infrastructure, because in most impoverished neighborhoods there's not new public transport, but this is final focus and they don't bring this up until the end that they're kicking out. So at least go with the fact that they're just going with repairs at this point, which means that we're going to have a couple of things coming off here. First, voter is going to be special interest. Remember, we tell you that these corruption goes all the way to the top. Their only answer is that it comes locally, but Knight tells you on a local level, like Charles tells you in summary, that there is unequal representation on these local boards, which leads to 3 times spending in richer areas as a result of the corruption even being on a local level. That's because even on a local level, politicians are still interested in garnering the most wealth they can for their elections, which is why they still do the same things as the corrupt senators at the top. But then, extend this edge to mere evidence that we tell you, like they try and get up here, and they're going to try and say it again, that it doesn't take place with their evidence. We tell you that court-mandated equalization has been happening over and over again for almost a century now, and every single time it fails. Don't let Max get up here and tell you that his is suddenly better. That court-mandated equalization will fail just like the rest of them. We provide you an analysis over 100 years. That outweighs on scope. Then the second voter is Leahy. This is really important because it is literally the only quantification on poverty and income inequality in the round, because they kick out of their TOC evidence, so they have no quantification left in the round where they can go after income inequality. We tell you we keep 840,000 people out of poverty, which increases their access to better jobs, increasing their chances of getting higher incomes, decreasing income inequality in the United States. That's keeping almost 1 million people out of poverty. That's the largest impact in the round, considering their number is at least going to be 0. Then the third voter is going to be terms. Remember that Legate tells you on a 16-study meta-analysis that gentrification displaces 2.5 million people, meaning that even if you're buying they're running both arguments, gentrification inevitably leads to horrible things, none of the positives they talk about, because they act like every poor person owns a home, when in reality these escalating rent prices will only keep more money out of the poor's pockets, more of them in poor areas, and overall increase income inequality in the United States. For all of these reasons, I strongly negate.
Alright, what was it? Like 50 seconds? Is that what you said?
Oh, shoot, sorry. Okay, that's fine. My bad. It'll be our first contention with the framework argument that came from their contention. I'll probably mention with you, and then our second contention. So this should be our case. Doing good. The round was over after first summary when they conceded the framework. The Municipal Research and Service Center explains policymakers can only do one thing at a time. Jones says our government drops issues out of consideration. This is key, because their only analysis on why we have to do the heap now, and the only reason that you would have a motivation to vote for them is on the heap, says that, like, one, politicians are supporting something in January, and they say it might stop supporting them later on, but one, they give you no evidence. Two, like, once you sign onto a bill, like, politicians don't go out and, like, put whiteout on their signature, right? It just doesn't happen. They won't retract support. But three, it's been 3 months since they read that heap argument. In those 3 months, the costs have been multiplying. You can do infrastructure now, and then do the heap later, get every single one of their impacts, about that 840,000 people in poverty, and you can flow it to the affirmative because we still get those impacts. And this is going to be really key because they don't respond to the Tyson or the Reynolds evidence. First, Tyson says, we wait 2 years, infrastructure costs from 5 million to 30 million, 6 times more because of cost acceleration, and it costs more to repair when things break more. And this links it to the Reynolds curve, which says we wait any longer, deferred infrastructure costs triple the cost of a normal family, driving up utility bills. They don't contest the framework. This means we can literally do both advocacies and get all the impacts that they talk about. But now let's go to special interests really quickly. They say that, like, special interests are going to be corrupt, but they don't respond to the Nicholson analysis that just says that local governments receive 75% of grants, and those local governments aren't corrupt. Even if that 25% is true, they don't like quantify how, like, those 3 times more spending in, like, these rich areas increases or decreases inequality. Well, we say that at least you have to prioritize the gain of impact. Now, quickly on our second contention, the only offense that he extends is that, like, one, our evidence, like, doesn't talk about, like, building new infrastructure, but, like, again, you can call for a case. It just talks about large-scale infrastructure investments. We don't have to build new stuff. If we repair, then the warrant is the same. Rich people will still move in. This gives us impacts. They, like, extend this Richards analysis that says that, like, that 2.5 million people are displaced, but Richards says that only 1.3% of residents are displaced, so the majority get the benefits. And finally, that gives us Hertz that says there's a 23% reduction in poverty, and Sharkey that says a lack of integration between the poor and the rich communities, the single greatest cause of income inequality over the 3 last decades, which is really important because it outweighs their case. And at the end of the day, you can always do infrastructure first and do everything that they talk about later, which is a clear vote for the affirmative.